This is our third week for this year, looking at the idea of Hanukkah and the concept behind it. And so I'm moving along in the process of what we've done for the last 2 weeks. And I want to say this, that it's always challenging to, how do I say this? It's challenging to bring people to a respectful and necessary understanding of why you've got to think bigger than the traditional Christian version of the gospel. I mean, I say that a lot, but the problem and the challenge is that to fully understand the magnitude of what I'm saying, I actually have to reveal things that you can intellectually process. And then after that, there's the obvious challenge of wrestling with, you know, I thought I knew what this is about, and now there's more to this, and that's complicated and that's difficult. And I think the especially difficult thing is to make people understand, obviously, that Jesus' Jewishness matters. And that's not an easy thing to do, in the sense of it's easy to explain elements that shows that, but it's not easy to get into everyone that you're talking to, into their heads, to make them actually have a shift in their logic about what's the implication of that to them. What does it mean for their expression of faith? So when you come to a topic like Hanukkah, it gets especially difficult because it's not a Christian thing. Um, Christians would say it's not spelt out as a definitive thing they have to do in scripture. Um, so how do you make people appreciate that? How do you make people understand this? And I think that's what I'm trying to do. Well, I have always been trying to do, is how do we find that blend between showing the heritage for people who want to believe in Jesus? And that's the safest way to say it, for people who want to believe in Jesus. Because as I did share on the WhatsApp group, was it yesterday or the day before? Um, it's a lot of damage gets done to the full story when we oversimplify who Jesus is and what he came to do. And I don't know if any of you, maybe Nandez, I don't know. I don't know if any of you have listened to Rabbi Damien's latest teaching, the part 2 of Got Milk. I managed to listen to it today, and something that he says on it that was nice to hear outside of me saying it. He made a statement where he said, basically more than one way he says this, but it came down to that if your gospel is just, he literally said this, if your gospel is just the cross, you've missed the bigger picture. You've missed the bigger thing that's happening. And if you think it's about us as human beings, he says, well, you've missed it again. And he goes into the kingdom concept. Well, he teased it a bit, like he says in the next 2 sessions, he'll be going more into that. Him and I spoke actually, was it last week? I think it was last week. He's been having a look at my book, Strange Gospel, and his first reaction to me was, you're a brave man for tackling this topic. Because when he started seeing what it's about, and that proves the point again, that he knows it too. He knows the work he does, like I know what I do, is controversial. When you start telling people to rethink what they think they know about the eternal security, that's not a simple thing to, and dare I say, neither Rabbi Damien or I will ever have the problem of a parking lot where we fellowship being too small, if I can phrase it that way. We're never going to have a problem with people not finding parking because they can't wait to get into your talk. And one of the reasons why is because when you tackle these difficult statements, these difficult things, you're not inclined to become popular. Nanda and I've spoken before about how successful we could be if we started a traditional, trendy Christian charismatic movement. It would be easy. Then we'd have a parking problem. But when you start digging into things the way we do and saying that the story is not being done justice, it's difficult to get people to stick around and hear you speak more than once. It's not that easy. But I think with tonight's session, I think it's going to be a little bit more easier to blend into a, how can I call it, a Christian friendly journey. Because tonight's session is going to blend a bit of the history of the Hasmoneans, of the Maccabees, the story of Hanukkah, and it's gonna lean more seriously, more noticeably into what would look like. And please don't misunderstand me. It's going to look like a Christian story is emerging. And when I say Christian story, I mean a traditional Christian telling of the story, but it's really not that. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you a Jewish telling of the original story. And I want that to remain very clearly noticeable and commit that to memory. I'm not telling a Christian version here now. So if anything sounds familiar, it would imply that it's portions that a Christian telling has borrowed from the Jewish version of the gospel, the Jewish version of what is the kingdom, and how does this look. I don't mind if that sits well with Christians who are going to listen to this either now, or Christians who will listen to it into the future online on YouTube or Castbox where we put this. I don't mind that it's going to make them smile and make them feel blessed and happy and excited. That's perfectly fine. But I want them to at least remember this is a Jewish story that they're going to be hearing tonight. So, copyright to Judaism kind of is the statement I want to make here. So your kingdoms, that's not a spelling mistake, your kingdoms, plural, come from the Hasmonean kingdom to God's kingdom. So let's do a recap. Now, of course, in the next few weeks, the series of teachings, this being the third week now, will be made available online. So you don't have to panic if you end up watching this video first, if you're not one of the live community members tonight with me. You can go back and check those videos or listen to that audio when it's made available soon. So here's just a quick recap. We started with this focus on politics before peace, Hanukkah election season in the first century. So what did I aim to do with this? We know that the Gospels, the testimonials, the testimonies, the witnesses, however you want to pose it, those 4 Gospels that we have, they come with an agenda. I've said it many times before, authors, communicators communicate intentionally. They do things on purpose and they intend for a specific meaning to be carried or to be heard when they speak. And I suggested that the gospel authors were politically motivated, which would sound strange because, again, Christian ears, well, Jesus came to die. That's the good news. That's the gospel. No, it's actually not that simple. And the authors weren't that simplistically motivated either. There's a lot more going on. So the mission for this year with Hanukkah is to show Jesus, of course, but to show Jesus again in his context and say, here's what you need to understand about the story you're reading when you read those Gospels. And again, anyone who really loves Jesus, that should be a motivation of the highest level. So let's do the story justice. And if we do the story justice, the only thing that can happen is we're going to see more of Jesus, which inevitably means we all win. And Jesus gets the glory, and ultimately God, the Father, gets the glory that is due in that situation. So I use this framework to show this is a political story, which it is. And then there were a few things that we looked at. I showed this, which I think was appreciated by those who saw it. Actually, let's just hear. Those of you that were on for this session, What were your thoughts when you saw this diagram? And not that we tried to understand the whole diagram in its entirety, because you wouldn't be able to, and you still wouldn't even tonight, 3 weeks into it. But give me your immediate reaction when you saw this, and then maybe when I started discussing some of the elements, what were the thoughts that you had, and even being overwhelmed and like, wow, this is more complicated than I first thought the gospel history was, because look at all, even that's an answer. So any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I was surprised, well, not surprised, but interested to learn about the different Herods
Right.
there were, and who did what. Um, and it was very informative. I love the diagram so that you can follow it through and just see who's related where, you know, like John the Baptist asked for Salome, but he rebuked this marriage between Antipas and Herodias. Yeah, very interesting.
Right. And Kathy, had you ever in any other church setting been confronted with this? Had
Oh,
you ever
definitely not.
been shown this?
No, definitely not. I've not heard it at all anywhere. No.
Right. And
You hear the
that's
outside stories like John the Baptist and Salome and about a Herod, but not, you know, all
right.
these different Herods.
And that's concerning, isn't it? Because these things are there in the text.
Yes,
So again,
absolutely.
it comes back to that question: how secure is your gospel if these critical elements, these critical players, has not been taught to you by those whose job it is to teach? That should
Yeah.
be a problem.
They generally don't, like just at the once a week church, they don't generally go into detail or depth, I should say, really.
Right. And that's a problem. That's exactly the problem. Because again, like
Yeah,
we're saying, if they're there, they were real historical people, and they influenced that content that we call the gospels.
yeah.
So it's hardly it can't be unimportant. Of course, it's not unimportant, actually. But okay, any
They should
other
do it like
thoughts?
they should do it like a serial so that you want to go back next week and hear what happens next.
Right. That could be a way, and it would be a history lesson.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it would be. But any telling of
Darren,
the gospel is a history lesson.
Darren,
Yes.
for me, it was like how hugely politically charged the whole thing was.
Right.
And it was like Jesus dropping in, parachuting in time into this really explosive political scene.
Right.
And just the involvement and how calculated each of the Herods were and how they manipulated. And the one that was it Marianne, his beloved wife, that he even killed because he thought she's a threat
Right.
to him. That was shocking. And then it actually takes all the nice touchy feely aspect of the gospel as we like to think of it, and makes the gospel hugely political,
Right.
because ultimately Jesus was a political Messiah. He didn't come to do all the things that we think he came to do in the generalized worldview. He basically was coming as as the Messiah, as the King. And our simple thing with he killed all the firstborns, Herod, to but with this backdrop of what this diagram shows, just shows you how intense it was. And then, as I said last week, the thing that really struck me was how people could just not rebel against such a evil king who just would kill all their firstborns. I mean, you know, you can touch somebody's horse, his chariot, his house, but when you touch his firstborn in the Middle Eastern culture, that was
Right.
huge. And yet everybody just accepted it. And it just shows the brutality of those kingdoms and of the absolute power that those kings yielded. And to give them, together with a Roman occupation, I suppose, gives us the backdrop. And I would say, and from what you've taught us, that the presence of Rome legitimized the abuse of power, because Herod was a lackey of Rome. Anything he implemented would be rubber stamped by Rome. So if you tried to overthrow Herod, Rome would come down and hit you with a sledgehammer.
Right.
And then you understand the zealots and why they were so passionate about, you know, killing the Romans and stuff. So yeah, it's much more politically charged than what we ever imagined.
Exactly. And that has to inspire, regulate, influence how we tell the gospel then too. And this is the point of that's the point of what we want to do with this Hanukkah series for this year again. So that is the that is the aim
But
of
then,
what we do.
but then Darren, in saying that, Jesus coming as Messiah inserted into this time and space was also misread, because they, you know, when he came in on the donkey. But as you said before, he could have been made Messiah then, had the
Yeah.
Sanhedrin been ready to accept him, you know, which is also lost on us, I think. And
Right.
then we
It
look
is.
at the second coming. So the second coming was almost a plan B. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, so it's a very complicated mix, because even in rabbinical eschatological Judaism, the idea is that every generation could usher in the Messiah, or by their actions delay him. So you've got that, it's like a question mark. And eventually, I think the point is that there'll just come a point where the wickedness will just tip the scales, but that would be the final point. Whereas there was the other option prior to that, that the generation was deemed worthy or called together enough for the Messiah to come, that he would then set up. And the irony is he did come, but the tragedy is obviously that the shepherds were corrupt, the Sanhedrin. And ironically, that's what we're looking at. Yeah. How did that corruption get to poison as much as it did? And to answer that, we literally have to backtrack to the story of Hanukkah and what happened after Hanukkah, which is exactly what we're going to do. And even tonight, there'll be a little bit of a hint at how the Messiah was predicted to look, and how it could have looked like some of the Hasmonean Maccabee leaders were poised to be messiahs, but then also to see how they failed, and then obviously why Jesus will come. So the point is, it's complicated. It is complicated, but it's a good complicated. It's an exciting complicated, and it's a complicated that actually, when we put it all together properly, gives due honor to Jesus, to the Father, and it shows God's love, and it shows the complexity of human beings, and it shows what we really like, and it shows how tricky keeping things on the right track can be. And that's part of the story of what Hanukkah can do. From that teaching too, you remember we looked at this, we spoke about the things Herod did, how he appealed to Rome, Mark Antony, how he gets his promotion. The Parthians, it ends up linking to those that came and brought gifts to Jesus when he was a toddler, not when he was born. They weren't in the in the sukkah when Jesus was born. They didn't come around the manger the night he was born. How the Parthians, those wise men previously, in a previous event, had tried to trick Herod into basically killing him effectively, and then he had a hint of it. This is obviously before Jesus being born now, and then he doesn't go, and the men that did go to the meeting were taken prisoner. And how that plays itself out again when Herod now kind of returns the favor, and when the wise men come again, this time he says to them, tell me where so I can come. But that's obviously also a setup. And then the wise men get told to go a different way, not to come back to Herod. And obviously the point of that story is, wow, so if Herod was almost ambushed like 30, 40 years earlier, then when people like Matthew and that are writing this version where they point out the wise men came, doesn't that mean that they are actually trying to, in the audience's mind, remind them of the history of the Hasmoneans, of the political instability in the situation, by then showing, look at that, kind of like what was done to Herod and he escaped being captured. That's happened here with the wise men, not themselves being captured because they wouldn't have been, but they would have inadvertently aided Herod in capturing Jesus had they gone back to him and given him information. And the answer is that what Matthew and guys like him are trying to make a parallel for? Yes. And so the obvious logic is how you can't afford to miss that. You can't afford to miss the historical element of that. And that's why we had to go through these things. Mark Antony and Octavius makes him king of the Jews after, and obviously this is just the summary because we spoke a bit about it in this session. I'm not going to try and do it now. The rich history and the intrigue and the backstabbing, it's like a soapy of what happens at the time. It's all there. It's history that's there. It's well attested to. You wouldn't have to look far to find it. And again, the point is this stuff matters. Jesus wasn't born into a vacuum. He was born into this, as my father says, parachuted in. He was born, and he was born so intentionally into that time that you got to then ask God, why did you do it then? And we're going to partially get into that tonight, actually, which might be interesting. So we looked at all the history, and then Herod, obviously by 37 BC, this is now like some, let's say, 34 years prior to Jesus being born, he's now in control of Jerusalem. So effectively, the world Jesus is born into has been influenced by Herod getting into power, which in itself is a knock-on effect. Herod getting into power is a knock-on effect, not of randomness. It's a knock-on effect of the story of the Maccabees, of what that Hasmonean dynasty, remember that's the kingdom, the Hasmonean dynasty. It's the Levites that were the heroes of the Maccabean revolt that makes the Hanukkah story, and what they did following 164 BC and moving up towards the time of Jesus' birth. Herod gets to be in power because of what they did. And so again, we're saying, oh my word, so we can't even just go 47 BC. We can't even just jump that little distance back because you still wouldn't have the bigger picture. You literally, to get the bigger picture of the first century, actually have to tell the whole Hanukkah story. It is a necessary thing. Okay, then the other thing we did was I said we're going to meet the parties, and we spoke about the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and obviously Rome with Herod. Gave some more background into these political, and that's what they were, political parties. Even if they were involved in religion, they were still political entities. That's what we said, and that obviously is still the case. Then last week, I did this session between a rock and a Herod place, talking about the world Jesus was born into. And I said it again, that we need to get the bigger picture of the gospel. And we looked again at this just to recap on what we had seen with this. And again, you can't, in sitting in the sessions with me, perfectly put this all into place. You can't. It's literally impossible. I don't expect you to. It takes work, but it's worth the effort. And again, my question is, to any Christians who are going to listen to this after the recording, ask your pastors why they haven't shown you this. because it does matter. And it's irresponsible not to know this. You can't do the gospel justice if you don't know this. You can't do Jesus justice if you don't know this either. Okay, then what we did was to just very briefly, we looked at some of the key leaders of the Asmoneans. So we know that obviously the main story began with Mattathias, which was the father, the priest who was in Modin, who didn't want to be influenced by Greeks. He's the one that sets off the powder keg effectively by killing the Greek soldier that's attempting to make them defile purity laws as priests. And this starts the revolt effectively that the Maccabees become famous for. Then we go through the father to son, and so on. Simeon was the son of Simeon was the son of Mattathias. He doesn't last very long. Then his son, John Hyrcanus, which we're going to focus on again today. We spoke about he was the one to convert the Idumeans. Now let's quickly just stop because it's worth doing that. Remember I said Herod gets into power because of the Maccabees? Well, here's where it started. John Hyrcanus does the very silly thing of the very thing that the Greeks were doing to the Jews, which was forcing religion via violence. He goes and does this to the Idumeans, and Herod is from that lineage. So it's a tragic irony that a Maccabee ends up causing the pain and suffering that will come to Jerusalem through Herod further down the line. So we looked a bit at that. We looked at the lineages of what had happened running down this line. And these things do matter. Again, we're not going to try and get into all of that right now, but these things actually do effectively matter. So before I go further, a disclaimer, because I'm going to need to do this disclaimer. I'm about to, over the rest of this session now, quote, probably honestly, I'm not even going to, it will be the case. I'm going to be quoting more extra biblical literature than I'm going to be quoting from the Bible directly. So if you catch your breath after hearing that shocking statement, here's the disclaimer. I think it's a Christian notion that if it's not in the Bible, it can't be true. That's the one mistake, because that's obviously false. The other problem is this. So much of what is in the Bible, now I'm talking even the New Testament, Paul, I'm going to focus on Paul as the main speaker to Christian listeners, to Gentiles, I should rather say. I'm going to show you evidence now because I need to defend my position that I'm going to be quoting extra biblical literature. I need to defend that position by means of this disclaimer. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you how much of, not all of it, please, this isn't even all of it. I want to show you a sample of some, I can't say of how many times because he did more than just this, of some of the examples of where Paul actually quotes in scripture something that's from extra biblical Jewish writing. So in other words, what you considered biblical writing actually comes from, ironically, non-biblical writing, because it's Paul quoting what's already been written in extra biblical sources. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to show you examples of Paul actually just quoting extra biblical sources, which means Paul studied these, loved these, respected these, and in fact taught non-Jews from these.